Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russian governor says counter-terrorist operation regime imposed in Belgorod. The United States says Russia's Wagner Group seeking to transit material acquisitions through Mali. Plus, South Korea and the EU agree to boost security ties amidst Ukraine-North Korea tension. Much obliged for your company this morning. The governor of Russia's Belgorod region says a counter-terrorist operation regime had been imposed near the Ukrainian border after a cross-border incursion by alleged saboteurs in the Graivoron district. However, a Ukrainian outlet cited Ukrainian military intelligence as saying two armed Russian opposition groups, the Liberty of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, both consisting of Russian citizens, were carrying out the attack. Speaking in a briefing streamed on social media, the Belgorod governor said a large part of the local population had left, either in buses or their own vehicles, and that at least 8 people had been injured. He adds the situation remains tense. Earlier in a Telegram post, he also says the Russian army, border guards, presidential guards, and the FSB security services were involved in the operation. Drone footage shows plumes of smoke rising in Russia's Belgorod region as the local governor said Ukrainian saboteurs had burst through the front line from Ukraine. In the short video clip, smoke could be seen rising above fields and buildings in the small town of Kazinka near the border with Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Russian President Vladimir Putin had been informed and that work was underway to drive out the saboteurs. However, a senior aide to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said Kyiv had nothing to do with the incursion, putting it down to Russia's emerging violent resistance movement. Meanwhile, Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin blasted Russia's military over the attack on Russia's Belgorod region, saying, in his words, today, the special military operation turned into a full war. The Telegram channel, Baza, which has links to Russia's security services, published aerial footage apparently showing a Ukrainian armored vehicle advancing on the Graivoron border checkpoint. Baza said there were indications of fighting in 3 settlements along the main border road leading into Russia. The open Belgorod Telegram channel said power and water had been cut off to several villages. A leading military analyst believes Bakhmut is still being contested, despite Russia's claiming it had taken full control of the city. Ukraine said its forces north and south of Bakhmut were advancing to entrap Russians inside the ruined city that Moscow says it captured over the weekend after Europe's bloodiest battle for ground troops since World War II. European Security Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, Ed Arnold, says the focus of the battle had been to keep each other's forces engaged there and not at other points on the front line.
It looks like Bakhmut is still contested. I mean, the Russians are in a dominating position on the ground within the city itself and have pushed the Ukrainians very far west. But then the Ukrainians look like they're also now pressing on the northern and southern flanks. But ultimately speaking, you need to see the battle in a wider picture that the Russians have pushed everything they had at it since August, and they've only just sort of captured the town. But equally, when you look at the imagery, I mean, there's nothing left of the town. It's a very insignificant point on the broader map, and actually what's really been it's all been about is to try and fix each fort so that they can't fight in other places within Ukraine. In terms of Bakhmut, nothing is left. So, control is not military, it's political. So Russia don't control the area. They have it in terms of they seize it, they are the forces on the ground. In terms of then turning that into some form of political control, reinvesting in infrastructure, actually making Bakhmut a bit of a hub, it's going to be very, very difficult. And the issue now is that the Russians will just find themselves in an area that they might not even be able to stay in long term because the infrastructure does not exist. So then the ability to then keep the city in their hands and then continue further west is going to be very, very difficult. It's the first time President Putin has publicly confirmed and sort of thanked Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner for their offensive potential. So to take them out so soon after would be a very curious move. But like I said in a previous answer, there is nothing there of military value anymore. So Wagner might redeploy to other areas now that they've sort of got that tick in the box. But actually rebuilding Ukraine's air force is much more about longer term defense and deterrence, which is going to be absolutely critical as support to current operations at the moment, and partly that is having an air force which Russia looks at and goes, actually we might not try offensive operations again, on the assumption that there's some kind of military resolution of the current war in the next couple of years.
The U.S. State Department said Russian mercenary force Wagner Group is trying to obscure its efforts to acquire military equipment for use in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that Washington has been informed that Wagner is seeking to transit material acquisitions to aid Russia in the war through Mali.
Obscure its efforts to acquire military equipment. We do believe that Wagner is trying to obscure its efforts to acquire military equipment for use in Ukraine, including by working through third-party countries where it has a foothold. We have been informed that Wagner is seeking to transit material acquisitions to aid Russia's war through Mali and is willing to use false paperwork for these transactions. In fact, there are indications that Wagner has been attempting to purchase military systems from foreign suppliers and route these weapons through Mali as a third party. We have not seen, as of yet, that any indications that these acquisitions have been finalized or executed, but we are monitoring the situation closely. We have sanctioned a number of entities and individuals across multiple continents that support Wagner's military operations, and we will have more to share on this question soon.
African leaders proposed that Ukraine accept opening peace talks with Russia, even as Russian troops remain on its soil. South African President spokesperson Vincent Magwenya said South African officials prepare to visit both countries to sell the idea of a framework for lasting peace. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the initiative on May the 16th, while President Macky Sall of Senegal leads the initiative. It includes Presidents Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt and the President of Zambia, which both voted for the resolution, and the Republic of Congo and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, which both abstained. The peace mission is expected to travel to Moscow and Kiev in early June. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said from a train that Ukrainian air defenses had shot down all attack drones, but not all missiles launched by Russia in an overnight airstrike. At least 8 people were wounded and scores of buildings were damaged in strikes on the region in southeastern Ukraine. Ukraine's air forces said on the Telegram messaging services Russia had launched 16 different types of missiles and 20 Shahed 136, 131 strike drones, and that Ukrainian air defense had shot down about 20 Russian drones and 4 cruise missiles. In a video addressed from a train, Mr. Zelensky said that 25 out of 25 drones and some missiles had been shot down. He adds that there had been hit targets and called for further air defenses. South Korea and the European Union have agreed to step up cooperation and security amidst tension over Russia's invasion of Ukraine and North Korean nuclear threats. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol held a summit in Seoul with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the European Council President Charles Michel, during which the leaders also pledged to work together on climate change, health, and supply chains.
And just like we do not accept Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, we condemn the DPRK's constant nuclear saber rattling. We stand firmly by the Republic of Korea.
Our new green partnership will boost cooperation in areas like renewables and green technology. Importantly, through this partnership, we will strengthen our cooperation on the safe operation of nuclear power, among other issues.
The United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, is pushing for an agreement to safeguard the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant ahead of Ukraine's planned counteroffensive. The United States and European diplomats said that the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, has 5 principles in mind to secure the plant: a ban on stationing heavy military equipment and military personnel at the plant, a ban on firing from and to the plant, including a ban on attacking the personnel at the site, protection of all safety and security systems at the plant, protection of all external power lines, and monitoring of compliance of the above-mentioned principles in their communique. Mr. Grossi plans to submit his 5 principles to the UN Security Council this month to prevent a nuclear accident. Now let's talk to Mr. Chidi Nwanu, a security expert, joining us virtually from London. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
This Belgorod affair has a potential, doesn't it, of emboldening other saboteurs, as Russia have called them, to make incursions from Ukraine into Russia in this daredevil attempt to attack the Russians. Firstly, do you believe that they are indeed saboteurs, or are we to believe the Ukrainians who say they are Russians who are resisting the totalitarian now regime of Putin, or they are indeed saboteurs according to the Russians?
Well, it's a fascinating kind of situation, and there's many levels to it. But just at the first, for the first question, it'll be very difficult to argue that they are not, elements of the Ukrainian forces when they are coming clearly from Ukrainian territory and they're using weapons and vehicles that are, gifted to the Ukrainians. And this is again done quite deliberately. It's not everything that you're seeing is part of a psychological operation as well as, a military operation. So the Ukrainians are quite clearly attacking Russia, but they are using Russians to do it and claiming that this is a Russian operation to liberate Belgorod, and they've even declared Belgorod to be Belgorod People's Republic. Now, why is this? The significance is that this is exactly what happened in Donbass. Russians invaded Donbass in 2014 using, Igor Girkin and, some of their special forces and then some other people, declared it Donbass People's Republic and denied all responsibility, even though everybody could see clearly it was the Russians. So this is the Ukrainians paying the Russians back in their own coin, doing exactly what was done to them. So it's a kind of, although it's a very deadly game, people are dying, it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of poke in the eye to say, we are doing to you what you did to us. And of course, there's a plausible deniability, which no one believes in that they're not involved. But by using vehicles, specifically, MRAPs, which were gifted to Ukraine, which no other power in that region has, they're also telling the Russians clearly that we're doing it, and we're doing it, but even though we're telling you we're not doing it, just to really rub it in. So it's kind of a long kind of tale of a psychological operation, a bit of revenge, for what the Russians have been doing in Donbass since 2014. But also there's a military impact to this, in that obviously there's the deep strategic embarrassment for Russia that the fighting is now taking place on Russian territory. But it's also part of the shaping operations, because the Russians are now faced with a dilemma. Again, as we addressed in our last discussion, the difference between a problem and a dilemma. A straightforward thing that the Ukrainians could have done would have been just, counterattacking in Bakhmut. That's a problem. The Russians then just need to set up their defenses and retreat it. But now they've got a dilemma. They have to now figure out. There's been so just to put this into a wider context, the Ukrainians have been attacking Belgorod for many months now. They've also been attacking Kursk and Bryansk and Rostov, all of these regions bordering Ukraine. Now, the Russians now have this dilemma that if they've attacked Belgorod, are they going to attack Bryansk tomorrow? Are they going to attack Kursk, in a week's time? They now have to find forces which they're going to push to the border and start securing those areas. That creates a dilemma. It's not just finding the men and the material, it's now creating new logistics routes, headquarters, all of that stuff which they now need to put there. That's all equipment that, even if it's drawn from other parts of Russia, is equipment and men that are not fighting in Ukraine. It's also, as I said, a deep embarrassment for the Russians. They launched this war and, it was supposed to be a special military operation that would not affect Russia, and now Russian territory is being fought over. And even now, that incursion hasn't been defeated. So the Russians are again being shown to be not as competent as they would like to portray themselves. And, the final point, just to address your question of whether these are internal Russian saboteurs or whether it would generate copycats. It would be unlikely to generate a copycat to this level because there's nobody else who's going to have tanks and armored vehicles. But there are a lot of disgruntled people in Russia. The Caucasus is very, very restive. The ethnic nationalities, particularly in the Far East and Siberia, they've suffered disproportionately from this war. So it is very likely that it might encourage some sort of copycat, but a localized kind of things like maybe somebody shooting at a police station, but nothing on this scale. But it is very embarrassing and very worrying for the Russians.
From your dilemma argument, is it therefore a probability that guerrilla warfare may be engaged by the Ukrainians if they can muster such forces?
Yes. So this is the unspoken thing about this war. The Ukrainians have been fighting on Russian territory since the beginning of the war. We see the attacks on the railway stations, on the roads. There've been, attacks, drone attacks, not the big ones that you see maybe in Moscow and everything, but there've been drone attacks on smaller places. There've been attacks on, as I said, on the railways, on bridges, and all of this stuff. So Ukrainian special forces or partisans have been fighting in Russia for a long time. Again, this is not unusual because Ukrainians and Russians are fraternal people. They both speak the same language, they look the same, they act the same. So it's quite easy for the Ukrainians to not only have people in Russia who will be supportive of them or who they've placed there, but also to put their own forces across the border and then engage in these activities. The question now is that, as I said, it's been in the interest of both sides to keep it as quiet as possible. The Russians, because they don't want the embarrassment of the Ukrainians fighting on their territory, and the Ukrainians because they don't want to provoke, an overreaction when they were not ready to deal with it. What you're seeing now is Ukrainians, again, this is what I'm saying, this is a deep psychological operation. The Ukrainians are now putting it as much in the open as they can and saying, we're ready for whatever you could throw at us. The obvious thing, if they'd done this at the beginning of the war, the Russian reaction would have been, very, very aggressive. But the Russians have thrown every single thing they've got to Ukraine, and there's little that they can throw more. And the Ukrainians are essentially challenging the Russians and saying, we're taking the war to you. What more do you have? And again, as I said, it creates this dilemma for the Russians. Do they now try and defend their territory or push into Kharkiv and defend Belgorod, or do they defend anywhere all else along the line? So it has many levels and it's problematic. But what the key thing that we're going to be looking at from now on is whether the Ukrainians will expand this kind of operations, and as I said, attack in the other oblasts, whether it's Kursk or Bryansk, and keep the Russians on their toes, or this is just a one-off where they've kind of, taken revenge for Bakhmut and taken attention off Bakhmut, but also laid down that challenge to the Russians to say, we're no longer afraid of you, we're going to take this war to you.
Mr. Wanu, help us make sense, therefore, of this allegation by the United States State Department that Mali is being used as a sort of Trojan horse to facilitate the transition of weapons under the cover of Mali through the Wagner Group. Mali is in Africa. How does this work?
Well, there's several countries in Africa that Russia has very strong links to: Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, and then there's other countries who maybe are not what I would say I would be, if I use the term Russian satellites, I mean, I'm not saying that, Mali, Burkina Faso, CAR are completely under Russian control, but there's a significant amount of Russian control. And then there's other countries who are strong allies of Russia, like South Africa. So those countries that are maybe, have a significant amount of Russian presence, like CAR, are not under sanctions, or at least Mali and Burkina Faso are under, West African sanctions, but they're not under the wider global sanctions that Russia is under. So I'm frankly not surprised that this allegation has come out. I'm actually surprised that it's taken, this long for people to talk about it, because the logical thing for the Russians to do once the sanctions came in was to divert all of their imports through these countries. So I wouldn't be surprised if you find Central African Republic is suddenly the world's highest importer of advanced microchips, because the Russians can't get them from the West where they used to. So Central African Republic could be a key destination. They'd import them, resell them to the Russians. It makes perfect sense for me. If I was a Russian, that's what I would do. From Mali's point of view, again, it's problematic. It creates another element of division between them and the wider global community. But you're unlikely to see anything come of it. There'll be some complaints. There'll be a serious amount of diplomatic pressure. There'll most likely be some loans that won't go through, or some aid that won't go through. But it's just, another facet of this war, and it's something that I am fairly sure everyone expected to happen.
And now that Africa is dragged into it, and this mention, conspicuously absent is Nigeria at the vanguard of this peace mission. We've heard of Ramaphosa, Museveni, Macky Sall. We know there's a transition to the next president for Nigeria. So things are, domestically speaking, we're kind of focusing on ourselves. But do you see Nigeria not playing a role in this peace mission being proposed by Sall and Ramaphosa as not being a good thing, or good, bad, or indifferent?
I think it's all of the above. It's good because this peace deal, this peace initiative is coming from a more or less, weak position. We don't really have much to offer. Well, all we have to offer is votes to the UN and, customers for grain or whatever it is. So there's not really a strong position that we're going there with. Although, we could build up a strong position. So the African leaders going there, it could be an alternative kind of path to peace. But, unlike the Turks or any other, power, we don't really have anything that, that we could put on the table that is going to incentivize anyone to listen to what we've got to say. So from that perspective, it's good that, Nigeria is not there. From the negative perspective, Nigeria is meant to be a superpower. Nigeria is meant to be the superpower of Africa. We, in the old days, went off and cleared Liberia, Sierra Leone, single-handedly. No one had to tell us what to do. We took charge. That's gone. Nigeria has so, declines that the entire focus of, our governmental priorities is internal. The main efforts of, for example, the Minister of Communication going to Washington was to talk about Nigeria's internal elections rather than, the grand affairs of state or the important geopolitical events that are going on in the world. And that's symptomatic of Nigeria's decline. Nigeria should be leading this initiative for better or for ill, simply because of our status, but we're not. And then when you come to indifference, the problem we've got is that, the initiative that's being proposed is frankly ridiculous. So it's being, all they're going to do is say Ukraine should negotiate with the war ongoing, and that's a position that Ukrainians will not accept. So essentially, what's the point? The Ukrainians have been very clear that they want the Russians to withdraw before they start any sort of discussions or negotiations, and they're claiming all of their territory. So unless the African delegation is going there with something concrete, like speaking to the Russians and saying we will give this concession or that concession in return for this, it's more or less an exercise in, just, showing the flag, showing presence. But from the wider perspective, Nigeria should be there because we are the most populated, powerful country in Africa, and we should be leading these initiatives. It's what I think is interesting, though, is that we have seen a strange shift, around this election. There was the effusive congratulations for the United States, for the United Kingdom, from all the key Western allies, and also from Vladimir Zelensky. I can't remember the last time Ukraine, jumped up and, congratulated the Nigerian president so quickly, or a Nigerian president-elect. So I think there might have been some, this is the realm of very wild speculation here, but I'm saying there might have been some sort of discussions, in the build up to the election, that maybe the new administration will be more favorable towards the Western position on Ukraine, and that might be one of the key drivers for Western support, despite all of the controversies that seem to be surrounding it. But we don't know. We'll see when they come in. But it's disappointing that Nigeria at least isn't taking some sort of a position on this.
You raised many interesting points, begging for time to elaborate even further. But alas, we thank you for the time you have spent with us on the program this morning. Always a pleasure. Mr. Chidiwanu, security expert, joined us virtually from London. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, Denmark says India, China, Brazil should be engaged in possible Ukraine peace summit. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United Nations has expressed concern that Ukraine's Black Sea port of Pevdinel in the city of Yuzhny has not received any ships since May the 2nd under a deal allowing the safe wartime export of grain and fertilizer. Now, the UN spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, did not say what was to blame for the lack of ships traveling to the port near Odessa, which is also where Russia used to pump up to 2.5 million tons of ammonia annually for export via a pipeline from Togliatti. Meanwhile, the Kremlin said that the European Union's reluctance to reconnect Russia's state agricultural bank to the SWIFT international payment network showed the bloc's non-constructive stance on the Black Sea grain deal. Moscow has previously said that the return of the Russian agricultural bank to SWIFT is a condition for its future renewal of the deal if it permits Ukraine to export grain safely from its Black Sea ports. The Russian newspaper had quoted EU Foreign Affairs spokesman Peter Stano as saying that the bank could only be readmitted to SWIFT once the conflict in Ukraine was over. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said in his words, "This really complicates the process, probably complicates the implementation of the Russian part of the Black Sea deal. But nevertheless, as we said, we will continue." The deal has been extended for 2 months, but 2 months is a fairly short period. It'll be over fairly quickly. The Polish defense minister said Poland is in advanced talks to buy Swedish early warning planes and hopes negotiations will be finalized shortly. Poland has ramped up military spending since Russia's invasion of neighboring Ukraine in February last year, with the government pledging to double the size of the army and spend 4% of the GDP on defense in 2023. He said in his words, "We are conducting detailed negotiations already, and I hope it will be shortly finalized with success. This way we strengthen the resilience of Poland, but also of NATO's eastern flank." He did not provide further details on the number of or type of aircraft discussed. Ministers from the Northern Group, comprising 11 NATO countries and Sweden, met near Warsaw to discuss security issues in the upcoming Vilnius summit. The ministers from the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia are scheduled to discuss various security topics, including the training of Ukrainian pilots for the F-16 fighter jets. The UK-initiated format will also address Sweden's admission status, as the Nordic countries may receive approval to join NATO at the Vilnius summit in July. Now, the Danish Foreign Minister, Lars Rasmussen, says Denmark will likely host a summit in July about how to find peace between Ukraine and Russia, but such a meeting will require engagement from India, China, and Brazil. The minister told reporters on the sidelines of the EU Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels that, in his words, "We need to put some effort into creating a global commitment to organize such a meeting." He said a peace summit should not just be attended by Ukraine's allies. It's necessary to build interest and involvement from countries like India, Brazil, and China. From there, Russia is set to introduce $1 billion monthly cap on the amount of foreign currency residents can buy on the domestic market to settle transactions with exiting foreign firms. That's according to a text published by the Kremlin. The cap issued by Russian President Vladimir Putin applies to deals approved by the central bank, finance ministry, or government commission monitoring foreign investment. The Kremlin says Mr. Putin has called for the measures to be introduced on June the 1st. Now, we're pleased to speak with Mr. David Awarawo, Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
There's a story we just read about reported about the Polish government ramping up its defense spending. This has happened across many nations. As a matter of fact, some of these nations that are giving out their military equipment and hardware to Ukraine are having to replace them. So therefore, it's consequential that defense budgets will rise. And in Poland's instance, the government has pledged to double the size of the army and spend 4% of GDP on defense in 2023. Poland has been very vocal against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you see this as a knee-jerk reaction, or do you see this as trepidation on the part of the Polish that indeed these sorts of invasions or conflicts may happen and they have to prepare for the future?
Well, the action of Poland is easy to understand. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has created apprehension, in that region. All the countries around Russia are now, very careful about their security. They are concerned about what Russia might do. And so each one is trying to ensure that it is prepared, so it is not caught unawares, just in case Russia decides to take action, military action against any of them or threaten their security. These are some of the problems that war creates. When a war breaks out, countries who want to assess their own, preparedness, internal security, and threats to them. Poland has assessed its own, and is convinced that it needs to show up its military in readiness for any eventuality from Russia. So it is very easy to understand Poland's position. More so since Poland has been very vocal against the invasion, by Russia, and has given extensive support to Ukraine in the course of the war. So it is easy to understand why Poland is doing what it's doing, just to prepare, just in case Russia decides to expand its military action, its violence beyond Ukraine to some other countries, some other neighboring countries in that region.
Post this G7 summit that held in Hiroshima, Japan, Denmark have come forward to say they'd like to host a summit, but that it should involve countries like Brazil, India, and China. Obviously, the G7 summit was one-sided. Lines were drawn in the sand, and these countries have talked about ramping up sanctions, where there was no talk from the opposition side on mediation. Is it that important that China, India, and Brazil attend this meeting in Denmark, should it happen?
Certainly. These are the kind of things that should be happening. Everybody cannot just, be pitched on one side or the other. There should be people somewhere in the middle who are interested in bringing an end to this conflict. So the efforts are welcome. These are the kind of things that will prepare the ground for, getting a draft that, both sides will look at and which may help to bring the war to an end. And regarding the involvement of countries like Brazil, China, and some others, it's also important. It is key. The countries that we meet should not be countries that are only pro-Ukraine. There should be countries that are also pro-Russia, so that they can find a middle ground somewhere in between. Recall that China, drew up a peace plan not long ago, but that peace plan was, too pro-Russian for anybody to take seriously. So we need a peace plan that will involve opinions, ideas, from all sides to the conflict. That is the only way to begin a genuine process that will bring this war to an end.
Nigeria's, what they say at times that silence can speak louder than words. Nigeria's seeming silence in this peace mission and in these attempts by Africa to be a part of peace in Ukraine, with the South African president's involvement, the president of Senegal's involvement, president of Egypt's involvement. But we know that May 29th is an important day and there's going to be a change of guard. However, our guest we spoke with before you raised an interesting point that perhaps is Nigeria not taking its place, its pride of place historically, and even expected of Nigeria as a power in Africa in these sorts of international relations. Is Nigeria giving up its position?
It is clear. It is clear that Nigeria is not where it used to be again in African affairs and in global affairs. It is unfortunate and regrettable that African states can come together to try to put up a peace plan, some arrangement to intervene to bring this war to an end, and Nigeria is not among them. I'm not sure there's any other time in recent memory where one can remember anything like this taking place, and Nigeria is totally excluded. It is testimony to Nigeria's decline in global affairs and in African affairs. Nigeria is a regional power, and there is no way anything like this, by African states, would take place without Nigeria being involved. Let us forget about transition. Transition is just, a transient process. Yeah, a couple of days, another government comes in, and the other government is expected to take on, to continue from where the previous government stopped. So the issue is not so much whether Nigeria is in transition from one government to the other. The issue is the systematic decline of Nigeria in African affairs and in global affairs in the last couple of years. In how many serious African issues has Nigeria, led the way? You can remember in the last decade. It will appear as if after Obasanjo left in 2007, Nigeria began a process of toboggan slide in its influence in African affairs and global affairs, and that has now been, manifested in Nigeria's, exclusion in this peace process. It is very unfortunate. In fact, it is a tragedy.
Now, that's food for thought. To the recent foray by alleged saboteurs of Ukrainian extraction into Belgorod in Russia, where do you sit? On the fence or either side? Do you think it's the Ukrainians that are doing it? Do you think it's the Russians who have people who are betraying President Putin?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think there are many Ukrainians who are posing as Russians to embarrass Russia and gain a psychological advantage. I also think that there are elements in Russia that are also involved in this. I think it's a mixture of both. And of course, the objective is to embarrass Russia, to make it, to present a position that there are many Russians who do not support the war, and that, Putin has made a mistake, and that, the path to honor, is for Putin to think about how to bring the war to an end. All of those are things that, these elements want to achieve. And they seem to be likely successful in that, because as we speak, now the debate is on as to whether, they are all Russians or all Ukrainians, or a mixture of Russians and Ukrainians. But I think is a mixture of Russians and Ukrainians. These are the kind of things that happen in times of war. It's not surprising. In times of war, people hang on to just anything they can, they can hold on to try to gain advantage and, turn the tide of the war, to the advantage. But one other point I want to, emphasize is that there is a large number of people in Russia who are opposed to this war. A few of them have been very vocal, and we know them. Some of them have been eliminated, since the war started. Many others, are afraid of what the consequences will be, so they are not vocal about it. But, their body language, the things they do reflect the fact that they are opposed to this. So they think the war is senseless, they think the war is unavoidable, and they think Putin has brought untold hardship to them for nothing.
As far as trade goes, this exclusion of the Russian Agricultural Bank from SWIFT, the international payment system, seems to be hitting them where it hurts. Peskov has spoken of it. The Russian spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has spoken of it. They themselves are saying those are one of the preconditions on staying with the grain deal that has been extended for about 2 months now, to which he says that 2 months is a fairly short time, and before you know it, it's going to be over. Readmit us into this. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, since the war started, the West has done a whole lot to try to bring Russia to its heels economically. But it doesn't seem to have worked much. If you look at the, economic performance of Russia in the past, a little over a year or so, you see that, the decline is just very minute. In fact, some say infinitesimal. And so the impact of the sanctions has not been quite what the West expected. And so this last action about SWIFT's exclusion and all, and the intense impact it's having, seems to be something that the West will hang on to get Russia to do things that before now Russia has not, been willing to do. And of course, one prominent issue is this, grain deal that Russia has been reluctant to be committed to. But at least the fact that Russia has accepted that some extension, even though not for as long as people will have wanted, is something along the line. And if the SWIFT exclusion continues to bite hard, that will give the West the leverage to be able to, build some other thing on top of it, to get Russia to shift grants on some of its hardline positions regarding the war. It's a good thing. Whatever can be explored to pressurize either side to see the senselessness in this war and begin the process to bring it to an end, the better. It's good. Let's see how far or how much influence, will be exerted on Russia, given this intense impact of the exclusion on the Russian economy. Well, it's still early days yet. Russia has looked for ways to evade many of these, the impact of these sanctions over time. And so let's just wait and see. But for now, I would say it's a good thing for the war, because anything that will help to bring the war to an end, is a welcome thing at this point.
Professor, there's a Yoruba adage that says, translated, says that if you beat a child or punish a child with one hand, use the other hand to draw the child closer. Do countries have a responsibility at the end of this war, because we hope and we pray it's going to end, and sooner rather than later, to leave an open door so that Russia can be readmitted into the Committee of Nations? This was a situation that came about because of an administration and not of the Russian people themselves, even though it was passed by the parliament. Our nations who have been very vocal and bitter against Russia, opening up Pandora's box probably for the future, where Russia will say, oh, even when Putin was doing this and we didn't necessarily support him, you showed how much you hated us, you hate the Russian people, or you hate the idea of the Russian state. Is there a danger that in the future that bitter sentiment may arise on the part of Russia or other nations because of this conflict?
It will take quite some time for the dust, for the effects of this war to, disappear. already there is inveterate animosity created by, the war and the response of the West. The sanctions do not affect Putin alone. The sanctions affect, Russians, in its entirety. And so, there is the feeling of, oh, the West is punishing us for a war that we're not consulted before it started, a war that was started by, just one man. I mean, the feeling will be there for quite some time. But, in terms of war, some of these things will not be the most important. It's how to get the sides to the war to, come to the negotiating table to bring the war to an end. That would be the most important thing now. The issue of, how to promote cordial relations in the post-war period, will be issues that will be addressed in the agreement that will be signed when the war is brought to an end. And the response to, Russians, how Russians are embraced after the war comes to an end. Already, the West tries to say, oh, we don't have anything against Russians. We are not fighting against Russians. We're against Putin and his war. But of course, when the West takes action against Russia, Russians are affected negatively. So it's like, a very delicate balance that the West has to maintain. But for now, I think the focus of the West is to prevent Russia from defeating Ukraine, and then somewhere along the line, coming to diplomacy and then bringing the war to an end. But, what people like us would advise is that the agreement that will be signed at the end of the war should be such that, pays attention to integrating Russia and Russians, to the global system, and then embracing Russians after the war comes to an end. These are the things that we will advise. But for now, that will not be the most important thing that, those involved in the war, like especially the West, will consider.
Thank you so much, Professor David Arowo, for being with us today, Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Thank you so much for being a part of the program this morning, and congratulations on your university being adjudged some of the best universities in the world. I think I read a recent survey of some sort.
Thanks so very much. We are doing our utmost. Thank you, Olumide.
When we return, U.S. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall says F-16s arriving in Ukraine will take several months at best. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine, as we explore now in the next few minutes how the world of business is affected by this conflict and vice versa. And happy to have with me in the studio Laddie Williams, my colleague of the business department.
Exactly.
Laddie, Russia has been targeted diamond-wise. Rishi Sunak has given he's banned it, the export trade with Russian diamonds. Yeah. Other nations of the G7 haven't done that, but they're looking in that direction as well. You said here it's a $4.7 billion diamond export.
Yeah, big one.
Worldwide.
Yeah, that's what Russia gets from their rough diamond exports. And definitely it's no easy task, stopping Russia from getting all of those export revenues, because we see at the end of the day, they are a major exporter, producer, of most of these commodities, needed globally. And one is diamond right now. They are the largest producers of rough diamonds, globally. That's about $4.7 billion. That's what they sold in 2021. And with this vast amount of diamonds, they get to export most of these to countries like India. And India, they are a big hub for polishing and cutting of diamonds and selling the finished products globally. So they get most of their rough diamond exports from Russia. So at the end of the day, if Russian diamonds are sanctioned, which is no easy task, at this point, because it's not easy knowing the origins of, most of these commodities. So that would impact India negatively, because they get most of their rough diamonds from Russia. So you see that interconnectivity, with globalization right now, that's going to impact about 1 million jobs, direct jobs in India, if they don't get those rough diamonds from Russia. Indirect jobs, about 5 million, will be impacted in India. So at the end of the day, when you see these sanctions, they have a far-reaching effect. And looking at just this diamond industry now, you see how hard or how big that industry is and how it impacts most countries that actually rely on Russia for some of these rough diamonds. So it's something they're still mulling at this point. It still remains to be seen how they're going to go about it, because at the end of the day, there's still that huge risk of secondary sanctions and trying to identify the origin of some of these commodities is a big headache. But at the end of the day, we see the U.S. and the allies still looking for ways to cut out Russia for most of those export revenues that they get.
I mean, we're looking at it as the cosmetic aspect of, of diamonds, the precious stone. But isn't it a luxury item? Why is it so? How come it's so important?
It is a luxury item, and we've heard sayings like diamonds are a girl's best friend, diamonds are forever, and all of that. So
well, obviously there are other uses for diamonds.
There are other uses, but most of the time, that diamond market is a huge market, for luxuries. If you're going to propose to your fiance, you get a big rock, at some point. So it's a massive industry, and it's one that rakes in a lot of money globally. So it ends up being Russia is one of the top producers there of rough diamonds. So that would definitely impact that market, negatively if they, find a way to actually sanction Russian diamonds, going forward. Definitely going to be a huge impact on that market.
Thank you, Laddie. Laddie Williams. Now, finally on the program, U.S. Air Force says it'll take several months to, at best, get F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. The administration has provided few details of the plan to equip the Ukrainian Air Force with the U.S.-made jets or other fourth-generation aircraft after U.S. President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. will support a joint training effort such as who will provide the aircraft or where it'll take place. U.S. personnel will participate in the training alongside allies and partners in Europe. Kendall said it'll take at least several months before Ukraine will have the capability to operate F-16s, and a number of details have to be worked out before Ukraine's Air Force will be able to fly Western jets in large numbers. And that's where we call it a day for this edition of special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Please join us again tomorrow for another edition. Good morning.